All right, welcome everybody. My name is Brooke Baller. I'm a dad of 3 kids under 4. I'm a runner, a behavior support practitioner, and a guy who thinks way too much about nearly everything in his life. From music to what I eat to how my decisions ripple out into the world around me. And this podcast is where all of that collides. Each episode takes one theme and runs it through the different facets of my life. As a father, as a clinician, as someone who is still very much just trying to figure it out. And today we're talking about masks. Specifically, how the masks we wear stop us from allowing ourselves to be who we truly are. So I'll start with a movie. The Mask, in 1994. Jim Carrey, Cameron Diaz. Probably not the most appropriate film for a 7-year-old to be watching, but nevertheless, there I was. And I'll be honest, I couldn't have articulated it at the time because I was 7, but something subconscious landed with me about the plot of that movie. This sense of what it meant to dream of being someone you're not, and how glamorizing yourself as somebody else eventually leads you nowhere but confusion. And again, to be honest, I wasn't thinking about any of that at age 7. At 7, I was the nerdy kid with glasses who paid way too much attention in class because, honestly, I loved school, and I still love learning to this day. I grew up in a town of 1,200 people, and my graduating class had 20 kids in it, from kindy all the way through to year 12. And I remember very vividly standing on the sidelines at recess, watching the rest of the boys in my class play football and psychoanalyzing every single move that everybody made. I was trying to figure out what exactly was happening here. And there was some history of sport in my family, but no one really ever pushed me. And because I didn't show a natural interest, my parents just sort of let it slide until I said something. And so I realized, looking at all these kids, that if I was going to make any friends in this town, in this place, I was going to have to get interested in this kind of thing. And that was the decision. At 7 years old, this natural version of myself that loved to learn and read Harry Potter and lose himself in every subject at school, maybe that couldn't be my primary identity here. And of course, the cost of that decision was that by the end of high school, there was this version of me that everybody thought they knew, when in all actuality, I never truly felt like myself. And it took going to university and then going above and beyond to move to the other side of the world before I finally realized just how much of myself I'd been hiding in the place where I grew up. The cost was true connection. The feeling of never being fully known or comfortable to share the fullest version of yourself with those around you. And for years, I placed a lot of that blame externally on the people that I grew up around. And now that I've matured, I know enough to understand just how much of it sits with me as well. And when you're a kid, you just don't know any better. And you need the people around you to make you feel comfortable enough and understood enough to just be yourself. And the consistent message I unfortunately received was that the real me was just too much, too deep, too intense. And so I learned to hide certain parts from certain people rather than ever feeling like I had one person or one group where I could fully be myself without the fear of losing that relationship. And I don't think that's unique to me by any means. But all I know is that the breaking point, when I really recognized the masking I was doing for what it was, came when I finally started going to therapy. I walked into that first therapy session thinking that everything would be fine. I would just talk about myself and my life like I do every other day to anybody who's willing to listen, and it would be no big deal. And what actually happened was more of an onslaught of words. I just laid it out on this poor woman, where I grew up, who my parents were, the messed up situations, the blurred boundaries, everything. I don't think I stopped talking the entire time, and she just sort of let me loose, let me go. And the second session started the exact same way. And then after a little bit, she reined me in. And so she had me do a couple of breathing exercises and got me to this baseline that felt so calm and so still that nothing was going through my head. Like, literally nothing. And I can't say that I'd ever truly experienced a stillness in my mind quite like that before. And there's this massive disconnect that I've always felt between my emotions and how my body feels, so my physiology, and what I'm thinking. They're not naturally that interconnected with me. So learning how to separate my thoughts from how I was actually feeling has been instrumental in understanding how masking has shaped my entire life. Because masking is predominantly all in your head. It's about perception. It's about making sure other people see you the way you want them to see you. And Brené Brown, one of the leading researchers in emotion science, defines perfectionism as the completely unrealistic belief that if you can behave perfectly, perform perfectly, somehow you'll avoid shame, blame, and judgment. And perfectionism is a bit of a form of narcissism in the way that it's all about you and maintaining that image and making sure that everything's perfect. And in that way, it really ties into this notion of masking, because you are doing everything in your power to protect that narrative, to maintain that status quo. But by definition, the irony is that you can't be perfect. And so what's the point? The point is that perfectionism is a coping mechanism, just like masking. It's about controlling what you can't actually control, not for very long at least. And masking lets you write your own narrative in a way, to do the best you can, to tailor the parts of yourself that you think people want to see or that people will be accepting of. And the sentence that lives underneath all of this is that I became so good at reading rooms and absorbing the emotions of other people that I forgot how to be in those rooms, fully present in my own body and just fully myself, feeling my own emotions rather than somebody else's. And so now here I am, a behavior support practitioner, which is just a fancy way of saying that I help families and care teams support children, predominantly, with disabilities. So that's often autism, ADHD, cerebral palsy, epilepsy. And all of these kids are masking too. They're trying to keep it together. They're trying to cope with day-to-day life as best as they can. And because I know what that's like, I think it puts me in a position to share my own vulnerabilities with these families and give them the other side of the story. Now, what masking looks like in the kids on my caseload is sometimes harder to spot than I initially thought. Predominantly, it looks like a kid who is totally different at school than they are at home. And the ones who cop it the worst are often the people the child loves the most, simply because they're the ones the child feels safest with. Sometimes that can be a bit of a hard message to get through to parents, because the collapse that these loved ones are experiencing, it's not defiance, it's this intense form of trust that just happens to be expressed through collapse. So the only way that you get the rawest version of this kid is if they trust you enough to know that you will love them no matter how much they lose it, or no matter how much they can't keep it together anymore. And unfortunately, some of the time these kids are often called fine by the teachers at school because they might literally be fine at school while they're keeping it together. And then they might explode in the car right as they're being picked up, or they implode the second they walk through their bedroom door. Then the masking gets missed because it just looks like they're coping. Or not at all. But nobody flags it until there's the yelling, the hitting, the property damage, all of the extremes. And that's typically when I am called to intervene. And by then, the mask has already been on for hours. And it's the nervous system that finally just can't take it anymore. It can't bear to maintain this status quo that takes over twice as much brain power to hold up than the typical person. And the thing about kids, and especially the kids that I'm working with, is that their nervous systems and brains are still developing. They're still learning these skills. And the common assumption is that they just need to try harder, when in reality, their brains, like I said, are already working in overdrive just to keep up that front. And so by the end of the day, they're totally fried. And by the end of the semester, they're so burnt out. And some people, might call that working in overdrive resilience. And, I would be quick to say that that's partially true, because in order to work twice as hard just to achieve the same outcome, you do need a specific type of resilience. But just because that resilience exists, it's not the same, or it's not valued the same as the resilience of, say, a neurotypical person, because it just gets them into the door of what normal neurotypical people can achieve and endure. And so it's not actually resilience, it's survival at a massive cost. And so I've got one kid in particular, the longest client that I've ever worked with, going on 3 years now, who embodies this perfectly. And in this insight framework that I have developed called the Personalised Behavioural Insight Report, we call this kid a Pathfinder. And as shorthand, I call him an octopus because he's awfully good at squeezing himself through the tiniest of openings and maneuvering his way out of situations he doesn't want to be in. And simply put, the Pathfinder is someone who runs on this internal compass. They've got their own logic, their own sense of what feels right, and they will follow that over anything that you might tell them to do. Every time. And it's not because they're trying to make your life difficult. It's because that compass is the only thing that makes sense to them when everything else feels like noise. And so this kid that I've worked with for 3 years is exactly that. He gets called oppositional constantly. Teachers might flag him, support workers might flag him, and everybody's got this label that they're ready to slap on this kid. And meanwhile, what I see is someone who reads a room and scans an environment faster than most adults I know and decides very quickly, consciously or not, whether what's being asked of him lines up with what he knows to be true. And when it doesn't, he either digs his heels in or will just go looking for what he needs in that moment. And when he does consciously decide that what's being asked of him lines up with what he knows to be true, it's incredible. He can be the most engaged kid in the building. And this is the type of kid, that represents this group of kids who are most likely to mask because the world keeps asking them to follow this map that doesn't match the terrain they're actually working or walking on. So they learn to perform this compliance, to say the right things, to nod at the right times, while the real version of themselves stays tucked away somewhere safe. Except for the fact that this kid in particular, I would argue, has a very, very low tolerance for that, respective to some other kids. And he is just one of the most independent kids you will ever meet. We're talking scaling a fence to get over to the canteen rather than asking the teacher to just let him through the door simply because he needed to do it on his own. And, people want me to wave a wand and fix these kids. And I'm not a wizard. The Pathfinder doesn't need fixing. No kid needs fixing. They need someone willing to understand the compass that they're already following. And I see this in my own kids already. So I have my oldest, who for confidentiality purposes, we are going to name Moo, because that's what we nickname him all the time. And Moo is extremely expressive and outgoing and verbal. He has the gift of the gab, just like his dad. And even at this age, I can see him hiding the truth from me at times because he knows it might make me upset or that I might be disappointed. And so what I do, what I've noticed is I try to narrate this script for him when I see this happening inside of him. And I have these phrases that I start and he finishes. And one of them is, I say, "What can you talk to Daddy about?" And he says, "Anything." And he always has this big smile when he says it. But one day I wanted to make sure that he actually understood what that meant, because it's one thing to just repeat the refrain that he knows to say. It's just a single word, easy to, follow through on. But the real meaning is maybe a bit deeper than that. So I probed deeper and I said, "You know what that means, right?" And again, he said, "Yeah," because he always says yeah, even when he doesn't fully know something, because he just wants to appear like he knows, just like his dad. And I said, "When I say anything, that includes things that I might not like or that I might disagree with." And when I said that, he looked at me. He had the most genuine expression on his face, and his smile just curled up, wide as can be. And he said, "Really?" And then he bull rushed me and gave me the biggest hug. Now, he's a bit dramatic, like his dad. But at 3 years old, it hit him that hard that he had just been told by a person he loved that he had someone who wasn't going to punish him for the truth. And what raising my kids without masks looks like right now is messy, to tell you the truth. I don't always get it right, and I'll be the first to say that. I'm one of the biggest hypocrites that I know. But all of us in our household, we wear our hearts on our sleeves and our attitudes on our sleeves as well. There's fireworks, there's pushback, there's disagreements, This is not a calm house, okay? It is not a calm house, but at the end of the day, I like to think that it is a safe one. You know where everybody stands. And my wife has been instrumental in teaching me, let alone now the kids, that conflict isn't a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if you don't know how to navigate it. And the most important part of navigating conflict is the repair process. And that's something we'll get into in a later episode. So stick around for that one. But I keep coming back to Jim Carrey at the end of the day. He was an idol of mine, and I loved nothing more as a kid than acting out scenes from his movies. But I think about all those characters he played. The Mask, Ace Ventura, the Grinch, the Riddler. He spent years becoming other people for a living, right? And it eventually drove him to a nervous breakdown. And he's talked publicly about losing himself inside of those performances and seeing Hollywood for what it really was. I mean, Jesus, look at the show, look at the Truman Show. He literally performed a movie where he grew up in front of the camera without actually knowing it. And we see that play out in real life, in real time, right now, in the age of the internet, except everybody's very hyper aware that they're being recorded. And I just really admire how real and open he's been about his experience of having to claw his way back to something real. And so you know what? Maybe fame is masking at its most extreme. You know, everybody says they want to be rich and famous, and maybe that's the price. And at the end of the day, every mask started as protection. It's that coping mechanism we were talking about. So the question isn't how to rip it off. It's whether the people around you have made it safe enough to put the mask down. So next episode, we're going to be talking about pressure from every angle, just like this time. And I've actually built a framework that helps families and teams understand what pressure actually looks like in real time, in relationships and inside of ourselves with respect to the emotions that we experience, and why the tools that most people use to deal with this were never really designed to work in the moments that count. So that's next time. Until then, stay bemused, stay curious, and I'll catch you on the next one.